hear you.
Okay. Okay, our next presenter is Dr. Neil Fourie. He's an animal production veterinarian in a private practice in Middelburg. He's also a specialist toxicologist, and during his career, he has been awarded with a SAFA Research Award for his career as specialist. I think he has problems. Just hold on for a minute. I'm just going to be on my cell phone with him. Okay. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Neil. He can continue with his presentation.
Okay, net so oomblik.
Hallo Helene.
Okay, Dr. Neil, jy is nou op die skerm. Laat sak net jou skerm so bietjie dat ons jou gesig vol kan sien.
Okay. Is dit beter?
Okay, Corlia, ek wil net hê jy moet vir my bevestig wat jy kan sien. Sien jy die aanbieding of sien jy vir Dr. Neil?
Ek sien al twee, so die aanbieding is groot op die skerm en dan is sy video klein bo.
Okay, Dr. Neil, ek gaan vir jou die aanbieding kontroleer. So soos wat jy praat, sê jy net vir my next slide.
Okay, so kan ek dit nie van my kant af doen nie?
Nee.
Okay, want ons gaan redelik vinnig gaan.
Dis okay.
Kan ek 'n cursor gebruik of glad nie?
Nee, jy sê net vir my next en ek next.
Okay, alright, dis fine. Hallo.
Nee, jy kan maar begin.
O, is almal op die lug?
Yes, almal is op die lig. I've already introduced you a while ago, so everybody is waiting in anticipation for your presentation.
Okay, good morning everybody. Sorry about the technical glitches. I'm a veterinary toxicologist and I've been working at Onderspoort Veterinary Institute for many years, and we've been diagnosing many toxicity cases, and especially in dairy herds. And today we're going to focus on dairy. Next, please. Just to give you a bit of a background, if you investigate a case, and I am getting many cases that has been investigated 3 or 4 years ago, and then we go to court, and then I look at all the evidence, and then I see what is lacking. And hopefully today I can give you some advice how to handle some of these cases. Hopefully we'll not end up in court. But anyway, all animals, and especially dairy animals, are exposed to roughage, concentrates, feed additives, water, and medication. So if you are looking for a problem, that is just a bit of a framework to look at. Next one. Many of our animals, although we are a very intensive industry, still do field grazing, and therefore you need to know the most important toxic plants in South Africa and in Southern Africa. We are not going to discuss, we've got 8 most important plant poisonings in South Africa, and there you've got them listed. We are not going to discuss them all because I don't think anybody milks in the Gifblaar area, in the Bushveld, nor in the Gousiekte area. The cardioglycosides are extremely important, and I will point that out to you now. Senesio and senesiosis in the Eastern Cape is very important. Geeldokkop is of no importance, and Vermeersiekte also not important. Lantana very important, and then Cestrum also very important, and we'll point that out now. So let's just give a bit of a background on our most important plant poisonings, and I'll show you where dairy animals were actually poisoned by some of these plants. Next one. Okay, we must do a bit of chemistry. If you're a toxicologist, you're in chemistry, and you need to know what's the difference between, we're working with the cardioglycosides now, and this is the most important group of poisonous plants in South Africa. If you look at the cardenolites at the top, you'll see these are plants like Nerim oleander, Gomphocarpus, Fruticosus. They are of no importance because they're too poisonous and animals don't eat them. If you look at the bufadienolites at the bottom, you will see on C17 there's a 6-membered unsaturated ring, and that's a bufadienolite. And on your right hand at the bottom, that is epoxysclerosidine, which is the most important toxin of any plant in South Africa, and that's yellow tulp. Next one. Okay, the bufadienolites, the name comes from the toad. It's not a frog, it's a toad. And if you look at the parotid gland there that I've squeezed, you'll see the white toxin coming out, and that's where the name bufadienolide comes from. It's a cardiac glycoside, and that's a toxin in yellow tulp, Humeria pallida. Next. Okay, that's the plant. Next. Close-up photo of the flowers. Next. And you can see it's a winter problem. It happens now. We've had a number of cases in the last 2 or 3 weeks. You can see in the background that there's no grazing, but the tulp is green. So tulp, remember that, is a winter problem. Okay. And what are the clinical signs? This is very important. Obviously, the heart is affected, and therefore you get tachycardia and cardiac arrhythmias. If you put your stethoscope on that heart, you will hear the arrhythmias. You get slight bloat. But the most important clinical signs is weakness of the hindquarters and respiratory distress. Weakness of the hindquarters, you can see in this animal, and eventually they go down. And what you found out in the last 2 weeks, these animals can stay down for 2 weeks. It's even after treatment. And I've never experienced that. Next one. Next. Okay, that's a distribution of tulp. Just go back one. The yellow is the distribution of Humeria pallida, the yellow tulp in South Africa. And then the green is slaankop in the western parts. And then down in the Western Cape, we get all sorts of cotyledons and tyloconins and athenesium poisoning. But the yellow area is the most important area of Humeria pallida, the yellow tulp. Okay, treatment, extremely important. The only thing that works is activated charcoal at a dose rate of 2 grams per kilogram body weight. The dose rate is important. Just go back one. I use a stomach tube to dose these animals, and I find it to be very effective. Don't try and chase an animal to a crush pen or whatever. You treat it there in the field where you find it. If you chase it, you will kill it. So 2 grams per kilogram of activated charcoal with a stomach tube. If they go down and they stay down, you don't need to repeat the activated charcoal, but you need to give them water if they don't drink water by themselves. We've treated animals in the last 2 weeks for up to 2 weeks, just by dosing them with water, and eventually they got up. But the initial treatment is activated charcoal, medicinal activated charcoal, at a dose rate of 2 grams per kilogram per os. Then we go to the next syndrome. Okay, synesiosis, a very important plant in the Eastern Cape, where we find many of our dairies. You will see this is especially in overgrazed areas, and this is just synesio that you see there. Okay, the most important one is Synesio latifolius, and the other one is Synesio retrosus, and that's the adult plant. It usually doesn't get grazed by animals, and it's usually the small plants in the previous slide. Okay, penicillin alkaloids, severe liver toxin, and you can see the severe macroscopic pathology here in the liver. They become icteric, they become yellow. You get hepatic fibrosis and cirrhosis. In acute cases, you might not even find this, because in acute cases where they've eaten a lot, the whole system of the liver that supplies blood clotting is messed up, and they just bleed to death. So this is what you see there, is the typical pathology on a more chronic case. Okay, Lantana camara. This is a plant invading the whole of South Africa. Previously, it's only been in KwaZulu-Natal. Now we find it in the whole of Limpopo, Mpumalanga. It even invades the bushveld. And this is an extremely important liver toxin. Okay, and as you can remember, the lantadine in Lantana camara causes secondary photosensitivity. As you can all remember, that plants contain green plants contain phytoerythrin that gets converted, or chlorophyll that gets converted in the rumen to phytoerythrin. And phytoerythrin is photodynamic. If phytoerythrin is not excreted, then animals become photodynamic. And you can see a Friesland cow, especially on the unpigmented parts, that's got severe photosensitivity. In this case that I investigated, the farmer treated these animals with tetracycline for about 14 days because he thought that they've got anaplasmosis or gall sickness because they were yellow. And eventually, when I went out to this farm, I found it was lantana poisoning. Okay, just be aware that in unpigmented animals or pigmented animals, you will only find photosensitivity on the muzzle and not on the body. So this is a typical brown cow that only shows photosensitivity on the muzzle. The rest of the symptoms are obviously icterus, rumen stasis, constipation, and a very, very difficult syndrome to treat because of the severe liver and kidney damage. Okay, there's an example of the liver damage macroscopically. And what we've published, that it also affects the kidneys. That was not known for until a couple of years ago. Everybody just thought it is a liver toxin. Treatment, very difficult. We just dose him also with activated charcoal just to do something, but the liver damage is so severe. Just something interesting about lantana is that for some reason, cattle will even graze it when there's abundant feeding. It's not a drought problem. For some reason, I don't know why, cattle just go crazy and they just start eating lantana. If you smell the leaves, you can't imagine them eating it. But we find it here in our area in the summer. It's not a winter problem. Winter, they drop off the leaves and animals don't eat it. But when there's good green grass, for some reason, cattle will just go in and graze lantana. Okay, we've, as toxicologists, we've always identified these 7 syndromes that I've shown to you at the beginning, but we've added one as one becoming one of the most important plant poisonings in South Africa, and that's Cestrum levigatum, inkberry. It also is invading large parts of South Africa. If you look on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see these shrubs, and in the Eastern Cape, they become trees. How they've absolutely got millions of berries on them, and it's spread by birds. And then on your right-hand side, you'll see the green plant that is often eaten by cattle, and it causes severe liver poisoning. Okay, there's the pathology. Severe liver degeneration, necrosis, eventually cirrhosis, and these animals die. Initially, the liver damage is so huge that the ammonia in the body can't be detoxified, and these animals can even show nervous signs. And initially, it was thought to be rabies until they diagnosed that it was Cestrum levigatum. So be on the lookout. I've spoken to some vets in the Eastern Cape. They say, you describe it as a shrub. In our area, it's a tree, and it's invading many, many areas of our farming land. Okay, the last plant poisoning I want to discuss is kikuyu poisoning, which is very, very important in dairy animals. This is a typical picture of the Eastern Cape where all the dairy farms are on typical kikuyu pastures. It's an absolute mysterious disease. It's a rumenitis syndrome. So you have necrosis of the rumen. And we've got 2 syndromes. One is associated with the armyworm and one not associated with the armyworm. But the clinical signs and the outcome is exactly the same. The armyworm disease starts with armyworms that infect these patches. And usually 10 days after the infection of the armyworms, these pastures become toxic for an unknown reason. And then we have these animals going down with forced stomach necrosis, severe dehydration, and bulbar paralysis. We'll discuss that a bit later. Although their stomachs are fluid-filled, they are severely dehydrated. Their eyes are sunken in, and the mortality is also very high in these animals. Okay, that's just a picture of the moth that lays its eggs, and then the armyworm is produced. And there are the armyworms. And when they infest a pasture, you get millions and millions of them. It's an unknown toxin. If you speak to some of the vets in the Eastern Cape, we've always associated this poisoning with the armyworms. And like Dr. Jan Olivier from Alexandria will tell you that they hardly ever seen armyworms. For some reason, Kikuyu pastures can just become toxic, and we don't know why. But at your bottom of your screen, you can see that in Australia and in South Africa, Fusarium torulosum was isolated from these toxic pastures. So we are not sure, are we dealing with a mycotoxicosis or not? The baffling thing about this whole toxicosis is that not in all outbreaks do we isolate the fungus, but this is just a clue to the future research. Okay, as I said, it takes about 10 days for grass to become toxic after armyworm infestation, and it can stay toxic for 4 to 6 weeks. That's important to note. There's rumen, atony, and tympani colic. And these animals show pain, grunting and kicking at the abdomen. And then there's neuromuscular signs as well. Bulbar paralysis means sham drinking. They try to drink water, but they can't. And as I said, there's an inability to swallow. They try to drink water, but they can't swallow. And what is amazing, that these rumens are fluid-filled. If you palpate the rumen, you just hear a slosh of fluid in the rumen, although they are very dehydrated. If you look at the eyes, sunken in. Okay, on a PM, that's what you'll find. A rumen full of kikuyu and fluid, and that's all. So that's very typical. If you scrape off the epithelium or the villi, you'll see the rumenitis, and that's very important in your post-mortem to do that. You'll see the redness there, the rumenitis, the necrosis. If you take histopathology of that, you'll get a result back of rumenitis necrosis. Treatment. Unfortunately, there is no treatment. It's like lantana. You can try with support and treatment, but unfortunately, when these pastures become toxic, a high percentage of animals die. There's a high mortality in these animals. It's a very sporadic toxicosis, but when it happens, you've got a big problem on your hands, and there's really no treatment for that. We can try and prevent and protect the pastures against these worms with insecticides. I won't recommend that. We need to withdraw the animals from the pasture. That's the most important thing to do. And then what is very important is to test the pastures for toxicity, because it can last for up to 40 days. And then you send in sentinel animals to see if the pastures are now found. Then the other syndrome of kikuyu poisoning is exactly the same syndrome, not associated with armyworm, and it usually occurs when there's a growth spurt after warm weather and highly fertilized kikuyu pastures. And then just for some reason, these pastures become toxic, and as I said, maybe it's Fusarium torulosum. Okay, to summarize on kikuyu, and I spend a bit of time on this now, because it's so important in our dairy producing areas. We are not sure whether it's a mycotoxicosis. It's a really mysterious disease. It has been isolated in Australia and South Africa, Fusarium, but we're not sure yet. Okay, let's move on to a few other plants just for interest sake. In the Western Cape, you've got the Star of Bethlehem, Chinkrich, in our dairy areas, cause severe diarrhea and blindness after about 10 days. A beautiful plant that you can even buy it in the flower shops, but highly toxic. In fact, in my experience, it's even more toxic than gifblaar as far as grams per kilogram body weight is concerned. Okay, and then I've left this for you to go and study annual ryegrass toxicity in the Western Cape, and then we got perennial grass toxicity as well. But a very important disease on the ryegrass, Lolium perennae, with the nematode infecting these seed heads, and be aware of that for annual ryegrass toxicity. Okay, we move on now from plants to fungal poisonings. And I would like to emphasize the importance of fungal poisonings, and in some cases, the unimportance, and where we overemphasize the importance of fungi. And I'll give you a few examples of this. There are examples on your screen of a number of fungal poisons. Let's go to the next slide, and then I'll explain to you what I mean. Mycotoxins can have a huge effect. It can reduce feed intake, nutrient absorption, altered endocrine systems, suppress immune function, especially in monogastrics. I won't say that in ruminants, and it can alter microbial growth as well. If you are not sure about diagnosis, don't just jump to a conclusion that it's a fungus. I've always said in the past that if you go to the medical doctor and he doesn't know how to make a diagnosis, he will tell you you've got a virus. If you go to a vet and he doesn't know what to diagnose, he said it's a fungus. It doesn't work like that. There are 5 pillars of diagnosis that can confirm your diagnosis. Firstly, obviously, a complete history of what has happened. Secondly, the clinical signs. Thirdly, the pathology, macroscopic and microscopic. Fourthly, chemical and fungal analysis. Chemical in the case of other poisonings. And then fifthly, laboratory animal testing, which I often use, and I'll tell you how I do that in these times. So those are your 5 pillars of making a diagnosis. So making a diagnosis of a fungal poisoning is very specific. You can't just see a fungus on silage and say, yeah, your silage is moldy and therefore your animals are not doing well. You need to make a specific diagnosis. To make a diagnosis of a fungal poisoning, you first need to isolate the fungus itself. And for that, there's only one place in South Africa that you can send your samples to, and that's the Plant Protection Research Unit of the ARC at Roodeplaat Dam. And there's the telephone number for you. And they actually grow up the fungus. It can take up to a couple of weeks. But then you've got the fungus known. That doesn't mean that fungus has produced a mycotoxin. After fungal analysis, you need a toxin analysis. And that can be done at the OVI, and we also use several international laboratories because some of these things are very difficult to analyze. Let's start with the first fungus, which I think has got some real importance in dairy herds, and that's ergot alkaloid poisoning. Summer syndrome in summer, hypothermia, and fescue food dry grain green in winter. The poisoning is caused by Claviceps purpurea, It's a fungus that infects the seed heads of annual ryegrass and, in fact, all seed-bearing grasses. You can clearly see these ergots in these plants. You can even identify it macroscopically. And that's another example of the ergot sclerosium in a seed head of a grass. This was a very specific case in dairy cattle fed on teff hay on the Highveld in the Free State. What happened is when they cut the teff, their mower was too low, and they've cut into the hay these yellow nutsedge, geel eintjie, Cyperus elenchus. And you could see how contaminated these seed sets were with Claviceps cyperi. And that went into the teff. And now you can see the summer syndrome. The morbidity is high, you get hypothermia. Because remember, what you get in this syndrome is vasoconstriction, complete vasoconstriction. So these animals can't get rid of the heat. And so they overheat, and that's why they're breathing with an open mouth. And they've got abnormal behavior, like walking into dams just to cool themselves down. And in winter, because of the vasoconstriction, the exact same Claviceps with a vasoconstriction, you get vasoconstriction to the extremities. And then you can see what happened in this bull. And the next slide will show you what happened, and this is the typical fescue foot, where there's no blood supply to the extremities. The reason why I've put in this is that I want to demonstrate to you that not all fungi are poisonous. I examined this case a couple of years ago, where these two silos got wet, and the maize, which was mainly used for human consumption, it was white maize, there's the mill in the backside, got wet, and it formed a cake, both these silos, of fungi, of moldy maize. So the white maize became dark brown. We couldn't even get it out with the augers. We had to cut with a cutting disc on the sides of these silos and dish it out with spades to get these maize out. And what you're seeing there is like 4 million rands worth of maize. So the farmer asked me, what can he do with it? He also had a feedlot. And I sent in samples to Roodeplaat, got an analysis back of 5 different fungi in there. Not one was known to be toxic to me. I got a toxin analysis. I couldn't find any toxins. And I said, let's try and put it through your feedlot. And to cut a long story short, he has never had production like that with these moldy maize. Because remember, although they can produce very toxic principles, they can also produce good stuff. Like if you take ionophores, like sinomycin, comes from a fungus. And some of these fungi produces more protein. So we've put all this maize through his feedlot. So this is just an example to tell you, don't jump to a conclusion if you see a fungus on something. You need to make a specific diagnosis. Let's talk about the more common fungi that are known. Everybody knows about aflatoxicosis. We're going to run through this very quickly because the rumen has got a fantastic mechanism of detoxifying some of these toxins. And one very good example is aflatoxin. It's a monogastric problem in pigs. So please don't phone me and tell me you've diagnosed aflatoxicosis in adult cattle or in dairy cattle. It doesn't happen. It's never been recorded in South Africa. The same with Leishmaniasis, moldy corn disease. Fusarium verticuloides, it's a horse problem. So even if you see this moldy corpse, obviously this will kill a horse, but it doesn't do anything to a ruminant. It also affects pigs, but the rumen has got a fantastic mechanism of detoxifying. Okay, and that's what it does in a horse. Causes holes in the brain, leukoencephalomalacia. Diplodocus is important in cattle, but only on harvested maize lands. So if you're down in the Eastern and Western Cape and there's no maize lands, you won't find diplodocus. It's up here in the Highveld where we graze the harvested maize lands now, and animals become recumbent eventually. That's the fungus. It starts from the base of the crop, it grows to the top. And then initially they start with a white base stance, muscle tremors, but eventually they go down. So the only difference between this and botulism for me is that these animals can still drink and eat. In botulism, they can't swallow. If you treat these animals well, they recover. Okay, now we come to a very serious fungus. Aspergillus clavatus. Sorghum beer residue poisoning, Marook vergiftiging. This is sorghum beer residue, very widely fed in many enterprises in South Africa, from dairies to feedlots. And on your right-hand side, you'll see that there's a blue fungus. Now, let me tell you, if you see a blue fungus, you run away. This is most probably one of the most toxic fungi that we are aware of. This practice was very common about 30 years ago to grow these seeds in these hothouses. And on your left-hand side, you can see the blue fungi. And that's Aspergillus clavatus growing on these sproutlings. It was fed and it was promoted as being the best ever. And then because of these poisonings, it disappeared and it resurfaced about 2 years ago. And there are again many claims against these companies selling these systems, not only because of the Aspergillus clavatus, but because the moisture content in these sprouting seedlings are so high that its nutritional value is too low. But look at the fungus and take note of that fungus on the left-hand side, at the bottom on the kernels, and that's Aspergillus clavatus. Okay, it's a tremogenic mycotoxin. What that means, the animal tremors. It shows muscle tremors, but we don't know what the poison is. It's unknown. Here's a typical young dairy animal that we experimentally fed at Onderstepoort after a huge outbreak. And this was not with Marook, it was in pelleted feed. It came from a food producing plant, but you can see severe nervous signs and tremors. And this is classic. It is also almost pathognomonic. This knuckling over of the fetlock joints at the back is, if you see that, your first thought must go through your mind is Aspergillus clavatus. And the reason for that is that, and you'll see the next slides, that the muscles in the back is so severely affected and the motor neurons going to the hind legs are so severely affected. So this knuckling over is almost pathognomonic. Okay, and there's the severe necrosis of the muscles, the dorsal muscles in the back. You can see it looks like fish, and you can even see it macroscopically. So just to sum up on Aspergillus clavatus, be on the lookout. We had a case about a year ago in a feedlot where when the first animals started dying, we had to slaughter about 800 animals in 2 days, emergency slaughter, because they were fed Marook. The Marook comes from the sorghum beer factories, and you must feed it immediately. If it's stored, then the fungus grows. It's good stuff, but you must feed it immediately. Okay, let's quickly run through Gossipol. Also something that I don't think is very important, and that's why I've included this, because many people diagnose toxicosis or diseases, and they're not really important. Okay, let's run through these. That's the plant, and we feed 2 to 3 kilograms of cottonseed or cottonseed oil cake in the dairy industry. Okay, that's the seed. Again, a disease of monogastric animals. I always have a doubt if they diagnose Gossipol poisoning in dairy animals, especially on histopathology, because I think there's no correlation between cardiac pathology and cardiac function. To give you an example, animals can die from cardiac glycoside poisoning and there's heart failure, or from gifblaar and there's heart failure, but there's no cardiac pathology. And then animals can show severe cardiac pathology on histopathology, but their heart function was normal. So in my mind, it's one of the most difficult organs to actually do histopathology on. And yeah, never trust a pathologist. Okay. So it's mainly a monogastric problem. Okay, then we come to some really serious stuff. Feed additives. Not much is used in the dairy industry, except for ionophores and urea. I'll leave beta agonists are not used in the dairy industry. Salt can be a big problem if there's no water available. If there's water available, it's not a problem. But let's start at the top. Ionophores. One of the most fantastic group of molecules. But as a toxicologist, I can fairly say that in the last 30 years, there's not a group of molecules that have killed more animals in South Africa than ionophores, if you don't handle them and use them correctly. Okay, there are the 6 registered ones. The only one is the top one, monensin. I won't call the trade name. The only one is registered for dairy animals is monensin at 10 to 20 parts per million inclusion in dairy animals, and registered specifically for ketosis. And if you read the claim from the company, they also say to increase milk production, but mainly to prevent ketosis. Okay. Ionophores, it's used as anticoccidials, especially in the poultry industry, as growth promoters, but then there at the bottom, to prevent rumen acidosis, bloat, ketosis in dairy animals, and ABPE. There's a wide variety of toxicity. Obviously, horses are the most susceptible, and we had some of the most severe poisonings in South Africa affecting horses. Poultry at the bottom, the least susceptible. These are LD50s we're looking at. Bovine, you can see 25 milligrams per kilogram, more or less, is the LD50. Okay, when do we get toxicity with ionophores? Usually when there was a mixing error, either the farmer himself or at the feed company. I am at the moment involved in 2 massive court cases where a dairy actually stopped functioning because of an overload of ionophores. We're still trying to prove that. And the biggest problem in this case, just for interest sake, I'm involved in many of these cases, being consulted as a toxicologist, is that often the feed or the consignment of feed that caused the poisoning is not available anymore. It was eaten up. So if you investigate any poisoning or any problem, just go to the feed troughs and get at least a handful or a bag full of food of that last consignment. And what many feed companies do, if there's a problem on a farm, they would come and they would pick up all the food, and then you don't have access to that. So your sampling is extremely important. Take as many samples as you can. You can always throw it away afterwards, but if you don't have it, there's no proof. In this one case, we've got a massive problem. The retention samples were not kept by the feed company, and that specific batch that maybe caused the poisoning of monensin was all eaten up. So our proof in this case is extremely difficult. Okay, it's a cardiac poison and obviously also affects skeletal muscle. Okay, let's jump closely to ammonia. I know it's very low levels are included in dairy rations, but there's only one thing that I want you to realize and know about urea poisoning, and that's the next slide. Urea is converted in the rumen by the urease enzyme to ammonia and CO2. The ammonia kills the animals. And this reaction, this chemical reaction that you see here, is optimal at a temperature of 49 degrees. That's high. You know, the normal rumen temperature is 39. Ruminous temperature is rectal is 38.5. The rumen is about 0.5 higher. But the higher the temperature goes, the more optimal is and quicker this reaction is. And then obviously also at a high pH. You need to know this reaction for your treatment. So if animals have taken in excess of urea, so what do you want to do? You want to bring the temperature down and you want to bring the pH down. And therefore, we give large infusions of cold water, 20 to 40 liters. And there you chuck in 2 or 3 bottles of vinegar just to bring the pH down. Water. We are nearly done. We are a water scarce country. Every farming enterprise should have its water analyzed at least once a year by a reputable laboratory like the CSIR, and there's a few other. You need to know what's going on because it's constantly changing. And you get nitrates, even prussic acid, fluorides. You need to know what the level of fluorides is. And there's a huge number of other minerals and metals that we need to know, macro and micro. What is going on with your water on your farm? And you need to get that analyzed. Good, medication. I just want to show you a very classical picture. It's very important to observe how your people that handle your animals are actually applying parasiticides, injections, implants. I stood next to a feedlot the other day, just observing, and they were injecting about 5 compounds in a site of 5 centimeters on the same side of the neck. So that's very common sense to tell him, I think you should inject them further apart and do some on the other side of the neck. If you leave people to just treat and you don't inspect, you will have problems. This is an example of a dairy farmer. I like this photo. I was still at Onderstepoort. This guy, Nigel, this when the porans came on the market, and he decided that Deadline was too expensive and he made his own. And he took an organophosphate and mixed it with cooking oil, and he poured it on these 20 animals. And as he poured it onto the last animal, the first one was still already dead. So use all remedies according to prescription. Copper poisoning, we're going to run through this very quickly. Before I start, chronic copper poisoning is a disease of sheep, as we all know. Sheep accumulate copper if it's in excess in the diet. If I summarize this, we can run through the slides very quickly. But there are two breeds that are very susceptible to copper, and that's Jerseys and Guernseys. And that's because where they're coming from. It's like the Ile-de-France. So these animals come from the islands of Jersey and Guernsey, and those islands are deficient in copper. And these animals are genetically, let's call it modified, to accumulate copper if they can get it. So I had a massive outbreak of copper poisoning in a Jersey herd in KwaZulu-Natal. Copper doesn't affect cattle except for those two breeds, and they are both dairy breeds. We can run through this. Like I said, it's a sheep problem, except for those two dairy breeds. Copper is accumulated in the liver, and eventually you get a hemolytic crisis. And at the bottom, the biggest antagonist for copper is molybdenum, and the ratio of copper to molybdenum must always be 10:1. 10 copper, 1 molybdenum in the ratio. Yeah, we call it chronic copper poisoning, but it's an acute event because the copper is excreted from the liver very rapidly under stress situations. And then you get a yellow carcass. Because of the hemolytic crisis, all the red blood cells burst and the animal becomes etheric. You get gunmetal black kidneys, and that's because of iron. Because your red blood cells has burst, the iron gets trapped in the kidneys, and that what you see in those kidneys is iron. Okay, and if you see red urine, in sheep, it's 99% copper. In cattle, obviously, it can be red water. In this case that I investigated, which I wish we could elaborate on, they also saw red urine, but they excluded red water, babesiosis. And then when I received the samples, we found these high levels of copper in the livers of this Jersey herd. It was one of the biggest Jersey herds in South Africa. And then we diagnosed copper poisoning. There's the liver, typical copper liver. Okay, let's finish off with the mother of all toxins, and that's botulism, because it's not a disease, it's a toxicosis. The toxin is produced by Clostridium botulinum. The bacterium grows on preferably dead material, and it's the most toxic toxin that we know of. It's so toxic that we can't, as toxicologists, determine an LD50. So we work with the median toxic dose, MDT. I don't want to explain how that works, but the median toxic dose for botulism toxin is 0.388 nanograms per kilogram. Now I want to show you what a nanogram is. If you take a kilogram, you divide it by 1,000, you go to a gram. Another 1,000, you go to a milligram. Another 1,000, you go to a microgram. Another 1,000, you go to a nanogram. So I hope you can get an idea what a nanogram is. So for a 400 kilogram animal, the medium toxic dose is 155 nanogram total dose. Now I want to explain to you, I don't want to show the calculations, I've taken that out for time. This is urea. We all know urea on the left-hand side is agricultural urea, on your right-hand side is feed-grade urea. The average of these little urea balls weighs 4 milligrams. You can see the different sizes, but on average, just to give you an idea, they are 4 milligrams. Now, if you divide that nanograms that was needed to kill an animal into 4 milligrams, I can tell you one of these little urea balls, the size of that, of botulism toxin, can kill 25,000 animals. That is how toxic botulism toxin is. Therefore, it is a non-negotiable vaccine that you need to include in all your operations. And with a booster, it's a toxoid, it needs a booster. And you don't need chicken litter. I've invested a case in KwaZulu-Natal where 200 animals died over one weekend because of botulism. Dairy animals, 200 dairy animals. They were feeding chicken litter and there was a dead chicken in there. I've dosed that chicken litter to an experimental animal. 1 teaspoon killed that animal. This is how severely toxic botulism can be. And you don't need to feed chicken litter. You can just have a dead bird in a water trough or a dead snake in a bale. And then that's it. So it's a non-negotiable vaccine besides all other vaccines that we are using. Okay, there's your figures. If you work it out, I won't bore you with this. One botulism toxin of 1 urea granule, the size of that can kill 25,000 animals. Okay, let's finish off. As toxicologists, this is the father of toxicology, Paracelsus. In the 16th century, he coined this phrase. Sola dosis facet venenum, that's Latin. And I always thought the Latin guys in my school were the most clever guys, but it's not that difficult. Sola means only, dosis is dose, facet is determines, venom is poison. Only the dose determines the poison. If we as toxicologists makes a diagnosis, we work out the dose. We look at the history, the clinical science, the pathology, the chemical analysis, and laboratory animal testing. And therefore, you'll see on my letterhead, this is my slogan, Sola dosis facet venenum. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neil, for your presentation. We will give opportunity for questions. Dr. Neil, if you can just adapt your screen so that we can see your full face.
Is that better?
That's better.
Helene, there are quite a lot of questions in the chat box.
Am I supposed to open it up?
No. Cordelia, can you read the questions, please?
Okay, so the first question is, what is the practical use of toxin binders in dairy herds in TMR, pasture and TMR, and then pasture mixed pasture?
You're putting me on the spot now. Okay. I don't think in ruminants got any value. So that's my straight answer. It might have a value in monogastrics, but in ruminants, I don't believe in that. I can't see any benefit.
Okay, and then the second question, instead of zeolite clays, what else is there in markets except VitK injection?
Sorry, just repeat that.
Okay, sorry if I'm pronouncing these not pronouncing it right. Instead of zeolite clay, what else is there in the market except VitK injection? Taking vitamin K?
I don't know what that clay is. Is that also a toxin binder? I assume. And again, referring to my previous answer, I don't see any value in that. Okay. The rest of the question, I don't exactly know what you're talking about. Vitamin K we only use in poisoning of the rat poisons.
Okay, perhaps the person can just add another comment just to clarify that, or they can ask the question themselves if they want to. But there is a third question as well in terms of kikuyu toxicity with army worms. Is there no actual or no natural indicators like influx of bird feeding from worms?
Sorry, I didn't get that either. The armyworm, it's a very interesting phenomena. You know, these moths, they come down with the high winds from East Africa, coming down with the winds, and then they especially go to the eastern side of South Africa, and then they lay their eggs on the kikuyu pastures, and then we've got these millions of worms hatching from these eggs, and then when we get these severe infestations.
I think the question was more of, is there any natural indicators? So you get influx of birds feeding from worms. So what natural indicators will there be from the armyworms?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, you'll see the moths coming down. That's the first indicator. But yes, there will be many predators feeding on these worms, but they are to such an extent that they, you know, it doesn't have an effect.
Okay, and then the next question just asked from Luke. He asks, they have Cestrum labigatum in their area. They're in the fall triangle. So what effect will it have on companion animals?
Oh, well, companion animals, it's highly unlikely that they will eat the berries. We've never had cases in companion animals, but he's in the right area. There's lots of Cestrum in that area. But it's mainly a cattle problem.
Okay.
I can't imagine. You know, you get puppies in companion animals, puppies that will eat plants sometimes, and they eat all sorts of funny things when they grow up. But we've never had a case of Cestrum poisoning in companion animals.
Okay, also asked with Maruk from the sorghum breweries, what would be a rough time frame with regards to feeding immediately? Should it be 1 to 2 days maximum under normal dry high fog conditions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's difficult for me to say. And I can't tell you 1 or 2 or 3 days. What farmers do, obviously, the ideal situation is to feed it as soon as possible. Then the second thing is you can see that mold, Aspergillus clavatus, visibly on the Maruk. And then thirdly, what farmers then sometimes do, if they couldn't feed it, say within a week, they would just take a rake and take off the top part of that heap of Maruk, because it doesn't grow in the middle, it grows on the top. So if you're not sure, you inspect it visibly, because it's one of the few fungi that you can see macroscopically with your naked eye. It's blue. If you're not sure, you take a rake and just scrape off the top 3 or 4 centimeters off that heap and throw that away.
Okay, looks like that is all of the questions, except if someone want to raise their hand. Nico du Plessis, I see he has a question. You can just unmute yourself and ask.
Good afternoon, Doc. How are you doing?
Hello, yes.
Just a question from my side is, when it comes to on your TMR, if you don't have roofing over your feed troughs, let's say it starts raining, the longevity of that feed in those cribs before you start getting urea poisoning and stuff like that, how long do you have in that span of feed in that cribs before you need to take them out?
Yeah, look, with urea, obviously you've got no time. Urea is so highly water soluble that if it gets wet, you've got a problem. Especially now, not so much in dairy animals, but when we feed licks, for example, in sheep and in beef cattle, and there's, you know, some of these licks contain 10% urea. And if that gets wet, you in big trouble. But for the rest, for the nutritional value, obviously your feed shouldn't get wet. That's the first answer to your question, because when feed gets wet, then that's the starting point of mold growing, fungal growth, and that sort of thing. So feed needs to be kept dry, and it also depends on how much rain you got. But you know, if you had quite a bit of rain on an open feed trough, I would remove it immediately.
Okay, no, 100%. That answers my questions.
Okay, then there is another question that just came through from Michelle. She asked, what's your opinion on home remedies for treating certain toxicities? So she said it probably would depend on the ingredients on the ingredients. For example, I know some farmers that treat talc toxicity with turpentine and cooking oil.
Okay, yeah, I like this question. Okay, I will try to use my language properly. So most of these home remedies is absolute nonsense. Not most, all of them. We are scientists. So if we treat talc, we use activated charcoal. If we treat a dog with temic or aldicarb poisoning, we use atropine. We use scientific molecules to treat diseases. Most of these homemade remedies, and I hear these stories every day. I can tell you stories of how farmers treat blue tongue with Dettol and injecting it subcutaneously. And this is just coming from our past. But we are scientists. There is no place for turpentine, copper wire in the ear to prevent wireworm, and this kind of nonsense, or injecting Dettol for blue tongue. It's absolute nonsense, all of these things. Sorry to be so blunt.
Well, she did ask for your opinion, so I'm sure it is fine. Yeah, okay, that looks like all of the questions. I don't see anything else.
Okay, this concludes our session for today. Thank you, Dr. Neil, for your presentation. And Dr. Martin van der Leek.
Yes, thanks, Julian. Thank you, Neil. Always informative. I just wanted to say that I've posted the links to the presentations, to the students' attendance list, and then also for tomorrow afternoon's student session. So I will repost them again during tomorrow. So great thank you to all our speakers again. Thank you, Elian and Corlea, especially, for putting it all together. And we'll see you again tomorrow then.
Bye, Martin.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. We'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.